Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Golden Age of Piracy. The Golden Age of Piracy is a common designation given to usually one or more outbursts of piracy in the maritime history of the early modern period. In its broadest accepted definition, the Golden Age of Piracy spans the 1650s to the 1730s. And covers three separate outbursts of piracy. Narrower definitions of the Golden Age sometimes exclude the first to second periods, but most include at least some portion of the third. The modern conception of pirates as depicted in popular culture is derived largely, although not always accurately, from the Golden Age of Piracy. Factors contributing to piracy during the Golden Age included the rise in quantities of valuable cargoes being shipped to Europe over vast ocean areas, reduced European navies in certain regions, the training and experience that many sailors had gained in European navies, and ineffective government in European overseas colonies. The colonial powers, at the time, constantly fought with pirates and engaged in several notable battles and other related events. Origin. The oldest known literary mention of a golden age of piracy is from 1894, when the Swedish journalist George Powell wrote about what appears to have been the golden age of piracy up to the last decade of the 17th century. Powell uses the phrase while reviewing Charles Leslie's A New and Exact History of Jamaica, then over 150 years old, and refers mostly to such 1660s events as Henry Morgan's attacks on Maracaibo and Portobello and Bartholomew Portuguese's famous escape. Powell uses the phrase only once. In 1897, a more systematic use of the phrase Golden Age of Piracy was introduced by historian John Fiske, who wrote, "At no other time in the world's history has the business of piracy thriven so greatly as in the 17th century and the first part of the 18th. Its golden age may be said to have extended from about 1650 to about 1720. Fiske included the activities of the Barbary corsairs and East Asian pirates in this golden age, noting that as these Mussulman pirates and those of Eastern Asia were as busily at work in the 17th century as at any other time, their case does not impair my statement that the age of the buccaneers was the golden age of piracy." Pirate historians of the first half of the 20th century occasionally adopted Fiske's term Golden Age without necessarily following his beginning and ending dates for it. The most expansive definition of an age of piracy was that of Patrick Pringle, who wrote in 1951 that the most flourishing era in the history of piracy began in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I and ended in the second decade of the 18th century. The idea starkly contradicted Fiske, who had hotly denied that such Elizabethan figures as Drake were pirates. Trend toward narrow definitions. Of recent definitions, Pringle appears to have the widest range, an exception to an overall trend among historians from 1909 until the 1990s toward narrowing the Golden Age. As early as 1924, Philip Goss described piracy as being at its height from 1680 until 1730. In his highly popular 1978 book The Pirates for Time Life's The Seafarer series, Douglas Botting defined the Golden Age as lasting barely 30 years, starting at the close of the 17th century and ending in the first quarter of the 18th. Botting's definition was closely followed by Frank Sherry in 1986. In a 1989 academic article, Professor Marcus Riedeker defined the Golden Age as lasting only from 1716 to 1726. Angus Constam in 1998 reckoned the era as lasting from 1700 until 1730. Perhaps the ultimate step in restricting the Golden Age was in Constam's 2005 The History of pirates in which he retreated from his own earlier definition, called a 1690-1730 definition of the Golden Age generous, and concluded that the worst of these pirate excesses was limited to an 8-year period from 1714 until 1722. So the true Golden Age cannot even be called a golden decade. Origins. Piracy arose out of and mirrored on a smaller scale the conflicts over trade and colonization among the rival European powers of the time, including the empires of Britain, Spain, the Netherlands, Portugal, and France. Most of these pirates were of Welsh, English, Dutch, and French origin. The buccaneering period c. 1650–1680. Historians such as John Fiske mark the beginning of the Golden Age of Piracy at around 1650, when the end of the wars of religion allowed European countries to resume the development of their colonial empires. This involved considerable sea-borne trade and a general economic improvement. There was money to be made, or stolen, and much of it traveled by ship. French buccaneers had established themselves on northern Hispaniola as early as 1625, but lived at first mostly as hunters rather than robbers. Their transition to full-time piracy was gradual and motivated in part by Spanish efforts to wipe out both the buccaneers and the prey animals on which they depended. The buccaneers' migration from Hispaniola's mainland to the more defensible offshore island of Tortuga limited their resources and accelerated their piratical raids. According to Alexandre Exquemelin, a buccaneer and historian who remains a major source on this period, the Tortuga buccaneer Pierre Le Grand pioneered the settlers' attacks on galleons making the return voyage to Spain. The growth of buccaneering on Tortuga was augmented by the English capture of Jamaica from Spain in 1655. The early English governors of Jamaica freely granted letters of marque to Tortuga buccaneers and to their own countrymen, while the growth of Port Royal provided these raiders with a far more profitable and enjoyable place to sell their booty. In the 1660s, the new French governor of Tortuga, Bertrand d'Ogeron, similarly provided privateering commissions both to his own colonists and to English cutthroats from Port Royal. These conditions brought Caribbean buccaneering to its zenith. The pirate round c. 1693–1700. A number of factors caused Anglo-American pirates, some of whom had cut their teeth during the buccaneering period, to look beyond the Caribbean for treasure as the 1690s began. The fall of Britain's Stuart period had restored the traditional enmity between Britain and France, thus ending the profitable collaboration between English Jamaica and French Tortuga. The devastation of Port Royal by an earthquake in 1692 further reduced the Caribbean's attractions by destroying the pirates' chief market for fence plunder. Caribbean colonial governors began to discard the traditional policy of no peace beyond the line, under which it was understood that war would continue in the Caribbean regardless of peace treaties signed in Europe. Henceforth, commissions would be granted only in wartime, and the limitations would be strictly enforced. Furthermore, much of the Spanish Main had simply been exhausted. Maracaibo alone had been sacked 3 times between 1667 and 1678, while Rio de la Hacha had been raided 5 times, and Tolo 8. At the same time, England's less favoured colonies, including Bermuda, New York, and Rhode Island, had become cash-starved by the Navigation Acts. Merchants and governors eager for coin were willing to overlook and even underwrite pirate voyages. One colonial official defended a pirate because he thought it very harsh to hang people that brings in gold to these provinces. Although some of these pirates operating out of New England and the Middle Colonies targeted Spain's more remote Pacific coast colonies well into the 1690s, and beyond the Indian Ocean was a richer and more tempting target. India's economic output dwarfed Europe's during this time, especially in high-value luxury goods such as silk and calico, which made ideal pirate booty. At the same time, no powerful navies plied the Indian Ocean, leaving both local shipping and the various East India Company's vessels vulnerable to attack. This set the stage for the famous piracies of Thomas Tew, Henry Every, Robert Culliford and William Kidd. The post-Spanish succession period. Between 1713 and 1714, a succession of peace treaties were signed which ended the War of the Spanish Succession. With the end of this conflict, thousands of seamen, including Britain's paramilitary privateers, were relieved of military duty. The result was a large number of trained idle sailors at a time when the cross-Atlantic colonial shipping trade was beginning to boom. In addition, Europeans who had been pushed by unemployment to become sailors, and soldiers involved in slaving were often enthusiastic to abandon that profession and turn to pirating, giving pirate captains for many years a constant pool of trained European recruits, to be found in West African waters and coasts. In 1715, pirates launched a major raid on Spanish divers trying to recover gold from a sunken treasure galleon near Florida. The nucleus of the pirate force was a group of English ex-privateers, all of whom would soon be enshrined in infamy: Henry Jennings, Charles Vane, Samuel Bellamy of Wider Galley fame, Benjamin Hornigold and Edward England. The attack was successful, but contrary to their expectations, the governor of Jamaica refused to allow Jennings and their cohorts to spend the loot on his island. With Kingston and the declining Port Royal closed to them, Hornigold, Jennings, and their comrades founded a new pirate base at Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, which had been abandoned during the war. Until the arrival of Governor Woodes Rogers 3 years later, Nassau would be home for these pirates and their many recruits. Shipping traffic between Africa, the Caribbean, and Europe began to soar in the 18th century. A model that was known as triangular transatlantic slave trade and was a rich target for piracy. Trade ships sailed from Europe to the African coast, trading manufactured goods and weapons for slaves. The traders would then sail to the Caribbean to sell the slaves and return to Europe with goods such as sugar, tobacco, and cocoa. Another triangular trade saw ships carry raw materials, preserved cod and rum, to Europe, where a portion of the cargo would be sold for manufactured goods, which were transported to the Caribbean, where they were exchanged for sugar and molasses, which were borne to New England. Ships in the triangular trade made money at each stop. As part of the war's settlement, Britain obtained the Asiento, a Spanish government contract, to supply slaves to Spain's New World colonies, providing British traders and smugglers more access to the traditionally closed Spanish markets in America. This arrangement also contributed heavily to the spread of piracy across the western Atlantic at this time. Shipping to the colonies boomed simultaneously with a flood of skilled mariners after the war. Merchant shippers used the surplus of sailors' labor to drive wages down, cutting corners to maximize their profits and creating unsavory conditions aboard their vessels. Merchant sailors suffered from mortality rates as higher than the slaves being transported. Living conditions were so poor that many sailors began to prefer a freer existence as a pirate. The increased volume of shipping traffic also could sustain a large body of brigands preying upon it. Pirate women. While most pirates were men, there were at least 50 cases of women entering the career of piracy. The best-known female pirates were Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Bonny developed a notorious reputation in Nassau, and when she was unable to leave an earlier marriage, eloped with her lover, Calico Jack Rackham. Mary Read had been dressed as a boy all her life by her mother, and had spent time in the British military. She came to the West Indies after leaving her husband, and joined Calico Jack's crew after he attacked a ship Read had been aboard. She divulged her sex only to Bonny at first, but revealed herself openly when accused by Rackham of having an affair with Bonny. When the ship was assaulted in 1720, the two women and an unknown man were the only ones to defend it, the other crew members being too drunk to fight. In the end, they were captured and arrested. After their capture, both women were convicted of piracy and sentenced to death, but stalled their executions by claiming to be pregnant. Read died in jail months later, many believe of a fever or complications of childbirth. Bonny disappeared from historical documents, but no record of her execution or childbirth exists. Barbary pirates. The Barbary pirates were pirates and privateers that operated from the North African ports of Tunis, Tripoli, Algiers, Salé and ports in Morocco, preying on shipping in the western Mediterranean Sea from the time of the Crusades, as well as on ships on their way to Asia around Africa until the early 19th century. The coastal villages and towns of Italy, Spain, and Mediterranean islands were frequently attacked by them, and long stretches of the Italian and Spanish coasts were almost completely abandoned by their inhabitants. Since the 17th century, Barbary pirates occasionally entered the Atlantic and struck as far north as Iceland. According to Robert Davis, between 1 million and 1.25 million Europeans were captured by Barbary pirates and sold as slaves in the Arab world between the 16th and 19th centuries. The early 17th century may be described as the flowering time of the Barbary pirates. This is because the introduction of new sailing rigs by Simon de Dancer enabled the North African raiders for the first time to brave the Atlantic as well as Mediterranean waters. More than 20,000 captives were said to be imprisoned in Algiers alone. The rich were allowed to redeem themselves, but the poor were condemned to slavery. Their masters would on occasion allow them to secure freedom by professing Islam. A long list might be given of people of good social position, not only Italians or Spaniards, but also German and English travelers in the south who were captives for a time. Iceland was subject to raids known as the Turkish abductions in 1627. Murat Reis is said to have taken 400 prisoners. 242 of the captives later were sold into slavery on the Barbary coast. The pirates took only young people and those in good physical condition. All those offering resistance were killed, and the old people were gathered into a church which was set on fire. Among those captured was Olafur Eagleson, who was ransomed the next year and upon returning to Iceland wrote a slave narrative about his experience. Another famous captive from that raid was Guthrithi Simonardottir. The sack of Vestmannaeyjar is known in the history of Iceland as Tikjaranith. One of the stereotypical features of a pirate in popular culture, the eye patch, dates back to the Arab pirate Rama ibn Jabir al-Jalahima, who wore it after losing an eye in battle in the 18th century. Whilst the Golden Age of European and American pirates is generally considered to have ended between 1710 and 1730, the prosperity of the Barbary pirates continued until the early 19th century. Unlike the European powers, the young United States refused to pay tribute to the Barbary states, and responded with the First Barbary War and the Second Barbary War against North Africa, when the Barbary pirates captured and enslaved American sailors. Although the US met with only limited success in these wars, France and Great Britain, with their more powerful navies, soon followed suit and stamped out the Barbary raiders. Decline. By the early 18th century, tolerance for privateers was wearing thin in all nations. After the Treaty of Utrecht was signed, the excess of trained sailors without employment was both a blessing and a curse for all pirates. Initially, the surplus of men had caused the number of pirates to multiply significantly. This inevitably led to the pillaging of more ships, which put a greater strain on trade for all European nations. In response, European nations bolstered their own navies to offer greater protection for merchants and to hunt down pirates. The excess of skilled sailors meant there was a large pool that could be recruited into national navies as well. Piracy was clearly on a strong decline by 1720. The Golden Age of Piracy did not last a decade. The events of the latter half of 1718 represent a turning point in the history of piracy in the New World. Without a safe base and in the growing pressure from naval forces, the rovers lost their momentum. The lure of the Spanish treasures had faded, and the hunters gradually became the hunted. By early 1719, the remaining pirates were on the run, most of them headed for West Africa, seizing poorly defended slaves. Effect on popular culture. Although some of the details are often misremembered, the effect upon popular culture of the Golden Age of Piracy can hardly be overstated. A General History of the Pirates by Captain Charles Johnson is the prime source for the biographies of many well-known pirates of the Golden Age, providing an extensive account of the period, in giving an almost mythical status to the more colorful characters such as the notorious English pirates Blackbeard and Calico Jack. It is likely that the author used considerable license in his accounts of pirate conversations. In 2002, English naval historian David Cordingley wrote an introduction to Johnson's 1724 book, stating, "It has been said, and there seems no reason to question this, that Captain Johnson created the modern conception of pirates." Johnson's book would influence the pirate literature of Robert Louis Stevenson and J.M. Barrie. Such literary works as Stevenson's Treasure Island and Barrie's Peter Pan, while romanticized, drew heavily on pirates and piracy for their plots. Various claims and speculation about their overall image, attire, fashion, dress code, etc. have been made and contributed to their fanciful mystery and lore. For example, men wore earrings as the value of the gold or silver earring was meant to pay for their burial if they were lost at sea and their body washed ashore. They were also worn for superstitious reasons, believing the precious metals had magical healing powers. More recently, even less accurate depictions of historical era pirates have advanced to the forefront. However, these phenomena have only served to advance the romantic image of piracy and its treasure-burying swashbucklers in popular culture. Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Would you like to know more?